Hi folks, welcome back. This week we are moving on to our units for our fourth quarter, and we're starting off with power structures. So we are going to be looking at different power structures. We're first going to start with power structures in theory, and then we'll look at how they actually look in real life. And the power structure we're looking at this week is called Autocracy. So what I want you to do is to read through this PowerPoint or go with it look at it through this recording, after you've looked at it, to reflect on some of the advantages and disadvantages of an autocratic government. And you can post a couple of those comments to our discussion that will be in the week of April 27th folder. And then lastly, you're going to take this information and test it out on Quizlet this week. So this is my first time making a Quizlet, and you can let me know how that goes and practice it, and also let me know how you do on your test. So, do you have to take notes? If you think that will help you with your Quizlet, go right ahead. You can always come back to the PowerPoints also. What if you get through this really quickly? Well, we have an extension that I'm going to put also in this week's folder about the Han Dynasty and two different rulers who were autocrats, but who actually practice it in a really different way. So you can look at that and you can kind of decide which one do you think is the truest autocrat. So those are your two options for extensions. So, autocracy. The basic definition is it is the power and authority are in the hands of a single individual. So sometimes that could be a king or queen or an emperor, then that would be called a monarch, or it can be someone who took power, right, through usually force, or it could be violent force, right? Whereas monarchy might be through birth. We're going to go more in depth with that. The word autocracy comes from Greek, which autos means self, like an automobile, right? Self-driving. And this is self-kratos, meaning power. In fact, all of the power structures we're looking at over the next few weeks will end in kratos: autocracy, democracy, oligarchy. All right. So in an autocracy, the leader is not chosen by the citizens. There's no voting or campaign. These people are in charge. And either, like I said, it was established and they were born into it, or it could be violent, and it could be one group taking over another and forcing them under their rule, a lot like the Assyrians when we were studying Mesopotamia. Either way, the leader is in charge, and the citizens really don't have any say in it. So the big difference between these two types of autocracy is not so much in how they rule, it's how they get and maintain power. That's it. Basically, in both situations, they are in charge and they can rule how they would like to, right? So it's not about how they treat their people or how long they rule. And typically, autocracies can vary quite a bit. You can have kings or queens who are very good to their people, as well as dictators to a certain degree. And you can have some that are truly awful. But in terms of how you get the power, a monarchy is where someone inherits it, right, through birthright. Like, for example, we see a lot in the medieval when you look at the kingdoms in Europe, like in England and Spain, and also in Japan. There were a lot of monarchies at that time, whereas dictatorships have also taken place throughout history when one group takes over another. They could already have their own kingdom and then take over another kingdom, and that would establish a dictatorship. Right. Sometimes the terms autocrat and monarch are used interchangeably, and they can mean very similar things. I mean, an auto means self-governing, right? Whereas a monarch means to absolute rule or the ruling by one, right? In Greek, monos means alone, right? So you can interchange them, but a monarch would only be someone who has inherited their rule, whereas a autocrat could mean that. It could also mean a dictator, right? Some autocracies are also known as theocratic governments, which means that theos equals God and kratos equals power. So in a theocracy, it is the belief that there is one sole ruler because they claim to have been put in power by God or by some supreme power. So a prime example of this is in ancient China, right, where we have the mandate of heaven, which we spoke about in our first quarter when we were talking about different philosophies. And it was a belief that in Tian that heaven granted these Chinese emperor the right to rule based upon their ability to govern well and fairly. So in ancient China, in order to keep that power, you always had to show that you were doing a good job for the people. If you did not, and there was some other group that saw your weakness militarily or politically, they could try to take that power and justify it by saying that you had not been fulfilling the mandate of heaven. So they use this a lot to justify their them having complete control over everyone was the mandate of heaven. And this didn't just apply to autocracies, it could also apply to oligarchies, where you have a few group of people ruling, and also democracies. And we'll be talking about those later. Another example of theocracies was also, we could see in medieval England. A king was seen at that time to have been appointed by a Christian god, and thus was pretty much only limited by things in the Christian church said he couldn't do. So you can see religion started to sometimes, in this example, have power over certain monarchs or kind of keep them in check. And that went on for a long time until we had Henry VIII, who maybe many of you have heard about. Henry VIII had many wives, and he divorced his first wife to marry another woman, and there's a lot of dramas created about that. But the sole motivator for him was that he wanted a son, so that he could pass down his kingdom to someone in his family, and his first wife was not able to produce a son for him, although we now know it's the men who determine that, right? So he, in order to do this, he had to separate from the church. So he was no longer operating under a theocracy at that time. And this caused a lot of problems. Anyways, there under an autocracy, there aren't really any laws or constitutions that restrain the authority of an autocrat, except for, like in this case, would be religious texts, especially in a theocracy. So those are some limits that you would see. Here are other terms you might hear thrown around in a conversation about autocracy. An autocrat, right? An autocrat is the ruler in an autocracy. So it could be a monarch or another governor or dictator ruling with unlimited authority and absolute power. A monarch, right, which we talked about, sole and absolute ruler by heredity, right? A king, a queen, or emperor. So absolutism is a more philosophical and political concept in which that believes that the ruler should have unlimited and centralized authority and power. All right. So like when you think about different types of government, some have centralized power and some have decentralized powers where different states will have power. A dictatorship is a form of government in which the person possesses absolute power taken and kept by force. So we will look at some examples of those. Let's look at our next slide. All right. So these are some other elements in autocracy. They do not exist in all autocracies. And sometimes they work out this way and sometimes they don't. Totalitarianism is an autocratic system in which the government strives to control every aspect of life. So a really easy example for you to maybe think about this is if you have read or seen The Hunger Games. That is a totalitarian system, right? In which they had surveillance through technology, secret police. They encourage citizens to report on each other. There's a lot of control, violent control and punishment, and you have to obey the government, and it usually comes from a place of fear, right? Other examples of totalitarianism in history include the USSR, communism under Mao Zedong, and Hitler. Authoritarianism is blind submission to authority, and there are many examples of this throughout the world, where a lot of times when you see military states where there's a hierarchy, it's very strict, and everyone obeys people above them unquestioningly. The last one is fascism, and that's a way to organize a society in which the government is ruled by a dictator that controls everything. And if you speak out against it, it's seen as treasonous. So the Nazi Party is also a good example of this. It involves a lot of us versus them. It usually only works or starts out in a state in which the economy is really taking a pounding. And I'm going to stop right here, and I'm going to come back in another very short video to go over the assignments. See you in a bit.